What if I told you that everything you thought you knew about Genesis, about the God you were told to worship, was a lie? Not a misunderstanding, not a mistranslation, but a deliberate, calculated lie meant to keep you blind to the truth. In the beginning, those three famous words paint a picture of a single, omnipotent God creating the heavens and the earth. But here's where things get wild. The original Hebrew doesn't say God in the singular. It says Elohim. Now, Elohim isn't a name, it's a plural word. It means gods. Not one being, but many. The text is shouting at us that there wasn't one God involved in creation, but a council of gods. Why has this crucial detail been erased from most modern teachings? The Bible as we know it wasn't written in a vacuum. It was forged in a melting pot of ancient myths and regional politics. The early Israelites weren't monotheists, they were polytheists, worshipping a pantheon of gods just like their neighbors in Mesopotamia and Canaan. Yahweh wasn't even the chief deity. That title belonged to El, the father of gods, or Baal, the storm god who ruled over fertility and weather. Yahweh was a minor player, a war god, elevated to supremacy later on. Genesis isn't a divine revelation, it's a rebranding campaign. Genesis chapter 1 talks about the creation of the world, and it's poetic, orderly, serene. Light and darkness, land and sea, animals and humans, everything falls into place. But wait. Look closely, and you'll notice Genesis 1 and 2 don't even agree. Chapter 1 refers to Elohim, the gods, creating humanity in their image, male and female, equal partners. But by chapter 2, the narrative shifts. Suddenly, we meet Yahweh, a singular entity, crafting Adam from dust and turning Eve into a sidekick pulled from his rib. These aren't complementary stories, they're competing stories. Genesis 1 exalts humanity as divine reflections, Genesis 2 demotes them to Yahweh's servants. Why the shift? Power. Control. Yahweh steps into the spotlight, claiming credit for creation and setting the stage for dominance. The plural gods of chapter 1 are pushed aside, their voices silenced. Yahweh isn't the benevolent creator we've been taught to revere. He's a usurper, rewriting history, seizing the throne. And humanity? We were collateral damage. And what about that famous command in Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it? Sounds empowering, right? But look deeper. This isn't permission, it's a mandate. It's a leash, disguised as a blessing. Multiply, yes, but stay in your place. Subdue the earth, but don't question your creator. A divine dictator micromanaging his subjects. The original myths that Genesis borrowed from don't tell this story. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the gods create humans to carry out their labor, to be their slaves. In the Sumerian myths, Enki, a god of wisdom, gifts humanity with knowledge, empowering them. But Genesis flips the script. Yahweh doesn't empower, he restricts. He forbids Adam and Eve from the tree of knowledge, keeping them in ignorance. Is this the act of a loving deity or a jealous tyrant? And if Yahweh's motives seem questionable now, just wait. The way Genesis rewrites the divine hierarchy suppresses the role of other gods and frames Yahweh as the sole creator isn't just a theological choice, it's a political one. The Israelites, exiled in Babylon, were desperate to unify their people under one God, one identity, one story. They didn't just edit Genesis, they weaponized it. This isn't just about theology. This is about power, who wields it, who keeps it, and who suffers under it. And when we strip away the centuries of dogma, when we read Genesis with fresh eyes, we're left with a stark, unsettling truth. Yahweh wasn't the ultimate creator. He wasn't even the original God of Genesis. He was a usurper, hiding behind the veil of Elohim, erasing the gods who came before him, and reshaping humanity's role to suit his needs. Let's talk about the Garden of Eden, one of the most iconic, most misunderstood stories in human history. We all know the setup: Adam and Eve, paradise, forbidden fruit, and, of course, the serpent. For centuries, this serpent has been vilified as the ultimate villain, the deceiver, the bringer of sin. But what if that's not the whole story? Yahweh plants a garden, places Adam and Eve in it, and gives them one rule: don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, stop right there. Why would an all-powerful God create a tree like that in the first place? It's not just sitting in some far corner of the garden. No, it's right there in the center. Visible. Tempting. A ticking time bomb waiting to go off. What kind of deity sets up their creations for failure like this? Enter the serpent. The Bible tells us it's the craftiest of all the animals Yahweh made. But let's be clear, the serpent isn't portrayed as evil in the original text. It's not Satan. That connection came centuries later, tacked on by theologians looking to tidy up the narrative. In Genesis, the serpent is just different. It speaks, it thinks, it questions. And what does it do? It tells Eve the truth. Think about that for a moment. Yahweh tells Adam and Eve, if you eat from this tree, you will surely die. But the serpent says, you won't die. In fact, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like gods, knowing good and evil. And guess what? The serpent was right. They didn't die. Their eyes were opened. They gained knowledge. The serpent didn't deceive them, Yahweh did. Let's dig deeper. In the mythology of ancient Mesopotamia, serpents weren't symbols of evil. They were symbols of wisdom, rebirth, and even immortality. The Sumerian god Enki, often depicted with serpent-like attributes, was known for his role as a teacher and protector of humanity. Enki defied the will of higher gods to give humans the tools they needed to survive: agriculture, writing, and yes, knowledge. Sound familiar? In this context, the serpent in Genesis starts to look less like a villain and more like a liberator. A bringer of enlightenment. A being willing to challenge Yahweh's imposed ignorance. Adam and Eve weren't cursed because they sinned, they were punished because they dared to seek the truth. And doesn't that punishment seem excessive? Banishment, pain in childbirth, a lifetime of toil, all for eating a piece of fruit. Yahweh admits the serpent was right. After Adam and Eve eat the fruit, Yahweh says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." Like one of us. Who's us? The Elohim. The plural gods we talked about earlier. Adam and Eve didn't just gain knowledge, they tapped into something divine, something Yahweh wanted to keep for himself. And he panicked. So what does Yahweh do? He banishes Adam and Eve from the garden, not to punish them, but to prevent them from eating from the other tree, the tree of life. Why? Because if they ate from that tree, they'd live forever. They'd become gods themselves. Yahweh wasn't protecting humanity, he was protecting his own monopoly on divinity. This isn't the story of a loving God guiding his children. This is the story of a jealous tyrant terrified of losing control. The serpent didn't lead humanity astray, it offered them a choice. Knowledge over ignorance. Freedom over servitude. And Yahweh couldn't allow that. Think about how this changes everything. Adam and Eve weren't the first sinners, they were the first rebels, the first humans to claim their own agency. And the serpent? The serpent wasn't a villain. It was a revolutionary. But why was this truth buried? Why has the serpent been demonized for millennia while Yahweh's actions go unquestioned? The answer lies in power. The serpent represents something dangerous to any authoritarian system, the idea that knowledge is a right, not a privilege. That's why it had to be vilified. How much of what we read in Genesis today reflects the original story? The answer is shocking, because what you think of as the Word of God is, in reality, the work of human hands. Edited. Altered. Manipulated. The Bible didn't fall out of the sky in its final form. It's a patchwork of revisions and omissions designed to control the narrative. And Genesis? It's one of the most heavily redacted pieces of ancient literature in history. Let's start with the basics. The version of Genesis most people know comes from the Masoretic text, compiled and standardized around 1000 CE by Jewish scholars called the Masoretes. But here's the thing, It's not the oldest version. Not even close. Before the Masoretic text, there was the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures made over 1,000 years earlier, around 200 BCE. And if you compare the two, they don't line up. Key details are missing. Sentences are altered. Entire sections are gone. Take, for example, the story of Cain and Abel. In the Septuagint, Cain's punishment for murdering Abel is far more severe. Yahweh curses Cain with unending fear and isolation, a far cry from the almost lenient treatment we see in the Masoretic text. Why was this softened? To make Yahweh appear more merciful? To sanitize the narrative for later audiences? We'll never know for sure, but the inconsistency is glaring. Look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the oldest surviving biblical manuscripts, dating back to the 2nd century BCE. These scrolls reveal even more variations. In some versions, Yahweh explicitly consults with other divine beings, Elohim, before making decisions, reinforcing the idea of a divine council. In others, references to these other gods are erased entirely. What we see here isn't divine inspiration, it's deliberate editing to fit a monotheistic agenda. Even the structure of Genesis itself is suspicious. Scholars agree that Genesis is a composite text, pieced together from at least two main sources, the priestly source and the Yahwist source. The priestly source, written by temple elites, emphasizes rituals, order, and Yahweh's absolute authority. The Yahwist source, on the other hand, is older and far more human. It describes a Yahweh who walks, talks, and even makes mistakes. These two perspectives clash throughout Genesis, creating contradictions that later editors tried to smooth over. One glaring example? The creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2. They're not just different, they're written by entirely separate authors. Genesis 1, with its poetic, 7-day structure, comes from the priestly source. It presents a transcendent God creating with absolute control. Genesis 2, with its earthy, hands-on Yahweh forming Adam from dust, comes from the Yahwist source. These stories weren't written to complement each other, they were written centuries apart, by people with radically different views of God. During the Babylonian exile, when the Israelites were taken captive in the 6th century BCE, their scribes were exposed to the myths of Babylon. Stories like the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, began to influence their own texts. You can see the parallels. In the Enuma Elish, the god Marduk slays the chaos dragon Tiamat and creates the world from her body. Genesis strips away the violence but keeps the essence, a god bringing order to chaos. It's not a coincidence. It's appropriation. Why does this matter? Because it reveals that Genesis wasn't written in isolation. It was shaped by political pressures, cultural exchanges, and the need to define a national identity. During the exile, the Israelites faced a crisis. Their temple was destroyed, their people scattered, their faith in Yahweh shaken. To survive, they needed a unifying story. And so, Genesis became that story, a carefully edited myth designed to assert Yahweh's supremacy and Israel's unique role in the world. But in creating this narrative, the editors of Genesis made choices that erased older traditions and voices. The goddess Asherah, once worshipped alongside Yahweh, vanishes from the text. The Elohim, the divine council, is reduced to a shadowy footnote. Stories that didn't fit the new monotheistic agenda were cut or rewritten. Genesis wasn't just a creation story, it was a battlefield. Behind the poetic verses and divine proclamations lies a story of conflict, a power struggle that's been obscured for millennia. Yahweh, the God of Israel, wasn't always the sole ruler of the cosmos. He fought his way to the top, rewriting history to secure his place as the one true God. And Genesis? It's his victory lap. The ancient world wasn't monotheistic. It was a world of gods, plural. In the Canaanite pantheon, there was El, the father of all gods, and Baal, the storm god who ruled over fertility and weather. Yahweh's origins are humbler. He started as a regional deity, a god of storms and war. But over time, he rose through the ranks, displacing the older gods to claim supremacy. Genesis reflects this struggle, not as an open battle, but as a quiet erasure of Yahweh's rivals. You can see the cracks in the story if you know where to look. In the original texts, El is the head of the divine council, a gathering of gods who govern the world. But in Genesis, Yahweh absorbs El's identity, taking his title and attributes. The divine council doesn't disappear entirely, it lingers in cryptic references, like when Yahweh says, "Let us make man in our image." Who is he talking to? The answer lies in older traditions, where the Elohim, the council of gods, deliberated on creation. But Genesis silences them, leaving only Yahweh to speak. This wasn't just a theological shift, it was a political move. The Israelites, surrounded by powerful neighbors with their own pantheons, needed to unify their identity. Yahweh's ascendancy wasn't just about religion, it was about nation building. To consolidate their power, the priestly elite rewrote the story, erasing El and Baal, and elevating Yahweh as the singular God of Israel. The rivalry between Yahweh and Baal is particularly revealing. In Canaanite mythology, Baal was the hero who defeated the chaos dragon, Yam, and brought order to the cosmos. His victory secured his place as the king of gods. Sound familiar? In Genesis, Yahweh takes on the same role, taming the primordial waters to create the world. But there's a key difference: Baal's triumph is celebrated, while Yahweh's is sanitized. The struggle against chaos is stripped of its violence, leaving only the illusion of divine serenity. Even the story of the flood echoes this conflict. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods send a flood out of anger, but one god, Ea, defies the others to save humanity. In Genesis, Yahweh acts alone, sending the flood and sparing Noah. The collaborative, chaotic dynamic of the gods is replaced by the singular will of Yahweh. It's not just a story about destruction and survival, it's propaganda, designed to erase the memory of a pantheon and cement Yahweh's authority. The suppression of Asherah, the goddess once worshipped alongside Yahweh, adds another layer to this cosmic conflict. In ancient Israel, Asherah was revered as the consort of El, the mother of gods. But as Yahweh rose to power, her image was systematically erased. The sacred trees and poles that symbolized her were torn down. Her name was struck from the texts. Yet traces of her worship remain. Archaeological evidence of inscriptions reading Yahweh and his Asherah reveal a time when she was considered his partner, not his rival. What Genesis hides is this messy, dynamic world of divine interaction, a world where God schemed, fought, and collaborated. Yahweh's rise wasn't the inevitable unfolding of destiny. It was a campaign. A hostile takeover. The divine council wasn't just a footnote in history, it was the victim of a purge. And Genesis is the cover-up. Let's face it, Genesis is not a love letter to humanity. It's a manual for control. The text pretends to celebrate our creation, but when you look closer, it paints a disturbing picture of how humanity was truly viewed, not as cherished creations, but as tools, servants, and pawns in a cosmic game of domination. The story begins with Yahweh creating Adam from the dust of the ground. Sounds humble, right? But look deeper. In the ancient Mesopotamian myths that influenced Genesis, humans were not created out of love or divine generosity. They were created to serve. The Sumerian Enuma Elish tells of gods who grew tired of their labor and created humanity to do the work for them, tilling the soil, building temples, and making offerings. Genesis borrows this idea, but masks it behind flowery language. Notice how quickly the narrative moves from Adam's creation to his assignment. Yahweh places him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. This isn't paradise, it's a job description. Adam isn't given dominion over the earth as a ruler, he's handed responsibility as a caretaker. And when Eve enters the picture, it's not as an equal partner, but as an afterthought, created solely to solve Adam's loneliness. They weren't empowered, they were managed. Now, think about the implications of the forbidden tree of knowledge. By banning Adam and Eve from accessing knowledge, Yahweh ensures their dependency. They're not allowed to understand good and evil, they're not allowed to make informed decisions. The message is clear: humans must remain ignorant to stay obedient. The punishment for disobedience reveals even more about how humanity was viewed. After Adam and Eve eat the fruit, Yahweh curses them, not just individually, but as a species. Women are condemned to pain in childbirth and submission to men. Men are cursed to a life of toil, struggling against the earth for survival. These aren't the actions of a benevolent creator. They're the actions of a ruler who views his creations as expendable workers. Compare this to the myths of other ancient cultures. In the Epic of Atrahasis, the gods create humanity to relieve their burden, but later regret the decision because humans become too numerous and noisy. They try to wipe them out with a flood, but one god defies the others and saves a remnant. In these stories, humanity is caught in the crossfire of divine conflicts but is never entirely abandoned. In Genesis, there's no remorse, no second guessing. Yahweh punishes without hesitation, enforcing his will through suffering. Even after the expulsion from Eden, the pattern of servitude continues. Cain and Abel's story is a chilling example. Cain, the farmer, offers the fruits of his labor to Yahweh. Abel, the shepherd, offers the fat portions of his flock. Yahweh accepts Abel's offering but rejects Cain's. Why? The text doesn't explain. But the message is clear: not all labor is valued equally. Yahweh prefers blood over crops, sacrifice over sustenance. Cain's rejection and subsequent punishment reinforce the idea that humanity exists not to thrive, but to appease. This dynamic becomes even more explicit later in Genesis when Noah builds an altar and sacrifices animals after the flood. Yahweh smells the aroma and declares that he will never again curse the ground because of humanity. Think about that. A God who supposedly created humanity out of love is appeased not by their survival, but by the smell of burning flesh. It's not devotion Yahweh seeks, it's tribute. The story of Noah's Ark is often told as a tale of salvation, a testament to divine justice, and a fresh start for humanity. But strip away the sugar-coated versions we learned as kids, and what you're left with is a chilling story of mass extermination. This wasn't a loving act. This was a calculated purge, a total reset orchestrated by a God who decided his creation wasn't worth saving, at least not entirely. Let's start with the flood itself. In Genesis, Yahweh sees that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And so, he decides to wipe out everything: humans, animals, even creeping things and birds of the heavens. All of it. Gone. This isn't just a punishment, it's an annihilation. And for what? Because humanity failed to meet Yahweh's expectations? Because they dared to live in a way he didn't approve of? The language used here is strikingly authoritarian. Yahweh isn't just disappointed, he's grieved that he ever made humanity. Think about that for a moment. The supposed omniscient, all-knowing God who created humanity is now regretting his decision like a child throwing away a broken toy. And instead of fixing the problem, he opts for complete destruction. This isn't the behavior of a wise and loving creator, it's the reaction of a deity driven by anger and regret. Now, compare this to older flood myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh. In that story, the gods send a flood, but the motivations are strikingly different. The gods are annoyed by humanity's noise and chaos, not their morality. And while they attempt to destroy humanity, there's a sense of remorse. Enki, the god of wisdom, secretly warns Utnapishtim, the Noah figure, to build a boat and save himself, his family, and animals. After the flood, the gods are filled with regret, lamenting the loss of life. Genesis, on the other hand, presents a God who doesn't just wipe out humanity, but does so with cold resolve. Noah is chosen as the sole survivor, but even this salvation is conditional. Yahweh doesn't pick Noah because he loves humanity or because he sees potential in them. He picks Noah because he's righteous, which in the context of Genesis simply means obedient. Noah is a yes man, someone who will follow orders without question. And the ark? It's less a vessel of hope and more a lifeboat for Yahweh's selective breeding experiment. After the floodwaters recede, the story takes an even darker turn. Noah immediately builds an altar and offers sacrifices to Yahweh. This act, according to the text, pleases Yahweh so much that he promises never to curse the ground again. Think about that. Humanity has just been wiped out, the survivors are trying to rebuild, and Yahweh's first concern is the smell of burnt offerings. This isn't divine compassion, it's self-gratification. Yahweh is appeased by the destruction of life and the ritualized tribute that follows. The rainbow, often portrayed as a symbol of hope and renewal, carries a much darker implication when viewed through this lens. It's not a promise of love, it's a reminder of power. Yahweh sets the bow in the sky, a literal weapon of war, as a sign of his covenant. But this isn't a covenant based on mutual respect. It's a one-sided agreement, a declaration of Yahweh's authority. He promises not to flood the earth again, but the subtext is clear, he could, if he wanted to. The flood wasn't an act of justice. It was a display of dominance. What makes this even more unsettling is the complete erasure of alternative narratives. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a plurality of gods, each with their own perspectives and motivations. In Genesis, Yahweh stands alone, unchallenged and unquestioned. The flood becomes not just a story of destruction, but a story of silencing. Other gods, other beliefs, other ways of understanding the world, all washed away in a deluge of monotheistic propaganda. The story of Genesis doesn't end with the flood. There's one final betrayal that reveals just how much Yahweh sought to keep humanity under his thumb. And it all centers on the tree of life. After Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, their eyes are opened. They gain awareness, an understanding of good and evil. Yahweh, furious, curses them and banishes them from Eden. But look at what happens next. Yahweh doesn't just send them away, he posts cherubim with a flaming sword to guard the entrance to the garden. The text explicitly says this is to prevent Adam and Eve from eating from the tree of life and living forever. Think about that. The tree of life was there all along, within reach, yet it was never forbidden until humanity dared to seek knowledge. Once Adam and Eve disobeyed, Yahweh's fear became clear. He couldn't allow them to eat from the tree of life and gain immortality. That would make them like gods. They'd no longer be mere mortals bound by his rules. They'd be his equals. And that was unacceptable. The tree of life represents everything humanity could have been: eternal, divine, free. But Yahweh ensured it was forever out of reach. This wasn't a punishment for disobedience. It was an act of containment. Yahweh wasn't protecting humanity, he was protecting his own supremacy. Immortal humans with the knowledge of good and evil would no longer need a god. They'd be gods themselves. The parallels to older myths are striking. In the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero embarks on a quest for immortality, only to have it stolen from him at the last moment. The gods in that story decide that eternal life is their privilege, not humanity's. Genesis reflects the same idea, but with an added twist. Yahweh doesn't just deny immortality, he actively removes the possibility of it ever being attained. The flaming sword isn't just a barrier, it's a declaration of dominance. Even more disturbing is how the tree of life disappears from the narrative. After Genesis, it's barely mentioned again in the Bible. It becomes a forgotten relic, its significance buried under centuries of theological interpretation. But its absence speaks volumes. The tree of life wasn't destroyed, it was hidden, guarded, and kept out of reach. The power it represented was too dangerous for Yahweh to allow humanity to access. This final act of betrayal encapsulates the entire story of Genesis. From the beginning, Yahweh's goal wasn't to uplift humanity, but to control it. Knowledge was forbidden, immortality was denied, and freedom was replaced with servitude. The Garden of Eden wasn't a paradise. It was a prison. And the tree of life was the key to escape, a key Yahweh locked away forever. It's no wonder this part of the story is often overlooked. The implications are too unsettling, too contradictory to the image of a benevolent God. But the text doesn't lie. The tree of life wasn't just a symbol of what humanity could have been, it was a reminder of what Yahweh took away. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the hidden truths of Genesis. If you've made it this far, you're part of a conversation that challenges millennia of dogma and dares to ask the questions others avoid. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you want to keep uncovering the secrets hidden in plain sight. Until next time, thank you for your curiosity, your time, and your willingness to look beyond the surface. See you in the next video.